Picture this. A man walks into Hollywood with a black ponytail, cold eyes, and a quiet confidence that makes every person in the room nervous. He doesn't audition, he doesn't beg, he doesn't even ask nicely. Studios start fighting over him before anyone has seen him act a single scene. Within 3 years, this man is making more money per movie than Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger combined. His face is on magazine covers. Kids are copying his moves on playgrounds. Toy companies are making action figures of him. He is the biggest action star on the entire planet. Then, almost overnight, everything falls apart. Not slowly, not quietly, publicly, humiliatingly, and completely. This is the story of Steven Seagal, and once you understand how it really happened, you will never look at Hollywood the same way again. A boy from Michigan decided the world needed a legend, so he built one from scratch. Steven Frederick Seagal was born on April 10, 1952 in Lansing, Michigan. His dad taught high school math. His mom worked in medicine. They were a normal, middle-class family living a completely ordinary American life. Nothing about that story felt exciting enough for the image Seagal wanted to project, so he changed it. In interviews, Seagal told people he grew up in Brooklyn, not Michigan. He claimed he trained with the greatest martial arts masters on the planet since childhood. He said he spoke fluent Japanese before he hit puberty. He told journalists about secret missions he'd run for the CIA, classified operations so dangerous he couldn't reveal the details. Each interview added a new layer to the story. Each new story was bigger and more dramatic than the last. And here's the wild part. For years, nobody checked. Nobody questioned it. Because when this man moved, when he demonstrated his martial arts on camera, the story felt believable. The truth, though, was actually impressive on its own. Seagal did start training in martial arts when he was young, around 7 years old. His family moved to Fullerton, California when he was 5, not Brooklyn. He showed genuine talent early, the kind of natural physical ability that cannot be taught. At 17 years old, he made a bold decision that almost nobody his age would have the courage to make. He packed his bags and moved to Japan to study Aikido, a martial art based on using your opponent's own energy and momentum against them. He stayed for over a decade. He married a Japanese woman. He opened his own martial arts school in Osaka. He became one of the very first Westerners in history to run a dojo in Japan. Japanese Aikido masters who trained with him confirmed he was the real deal. The skills were legitimate. The dedication was genuine. For a young American kid in the 1970s, that kind of commitment to a foreign culture and a difficult discipline was remarkable. But Seagal couldn't let remarkable be enough. He needed mythical. And that hunger for something bigger than the truth would eventually swallow everything he built. By the early 1980s, Seagal was back in Los Angeles teaching Aikido.
If your country stopped believing in you, would you leave or fight back?
His timing was perfect. Karate Kid had just hit movie theaters. Americans were obsessed with Eastern philosophy, discipline, and the mysterious wisdom of martial arts. Seagal's dojo started attracting celebrities, wealthy clients, and people who wanted to feel like they were touching something exotic and powerful. He wasn't just teaching self-defense, he was selling a feeling. He'd demonstrate techniques on students with dramatic flair, dropping people to the floor while calmly explaining the spiritual principles behind each movement. The ponytail, the quiet intensity, the way he talked in slow, deliberate sentences, like every word carried ancient wisdom. People were fascinated. One of those fascinated students changed everything. Michael Ovitz was the most powerful talent agent in Hollywood history. He built the creative agency into an empire that represented Tom Cruise, Martin Scorsese, and dozens of the biggest names in entertainment. When Ovitz started training with Seagal, something clicked in his mind immediately. Here was a man who could genuinely fight, who had real martial arts credentials from Japan, but who also had the look and presence to carry a movie. Nobody in action cinema was doing Aikido. Nobody looked or moved like Seagal. Ovitz didn't just see a client, he saw a revolution waiting to happen, and Michael Ovitz had the power to make revolutions happen. In 1988, a movie called Above the Law hit theaters with a marketing campaign built around one simple question: who is Steven Seagal? Audiences had never seen Aikido on a movie screen before. The way Seagal moved was completely different from the spinning kicks of karate films or the brutal slugfests of boxing movies. There was something almost hypnotic about it. No wasted motion, no showboating, just fast, precise violence that ended before the bad guys even understood what was happening. Arms snapping, bodies dropping, opponents sent flying through the air like they weighed nothing. People were mesmerized. The film cost $8 million to make and earned $40 million at the box office. For a debut from someone audiences had never heard of, that number was extraordinary. Studios started calculating sequel potential before the opening weekend was finished. But the box office numbers were only part of the story. What truly shocked Hollywood was what Seagal had negotiated before a single frame was filmed. Michael Ovitz had used his enormous power to force Warner Brothers into giving this unknown Aikido instructor something established stars couldn't always get: complete creative control. Seagal co-wrote the script. He directed certain scenes when he disagreed with the director's choices. He designed every single fight sequence himself. And he had one rule that was completely non-negotiable. His character could not lose, ever. He could not be hit in a way that made him look weak. He could not bleed unless it made him look tougher. He could not show doubt, fear, or vulnerability. The character had to be perfect and invincible in every single scene. Studios looked at the box office numbers and said yes to...
Would you rather die legendary but alone, or forgotten but loved?
everything. The next 3 years felt like a rocket launch. Hard to Kill came out in 1990 and made $47 million. Marked for Death that same year pulled in $57 million. Out for Justice in 1991 opened at #1, crushing every other film in its path. Seagal was now commanding $10 million per picture, putting him in the same elite category as Schwarzenegger and Stallone. What made it even more remarkable was the math. Schwarzenegger's movies needed massive budgets for enormous sets, complicated special effects, and expensive production designs. Seagal's movies needed cameras, some locations, and stunt performers willing to take hard falls. The profit margins were almost embarrassing. Then came Under Siege in 1992, and that film felt like a different level entirely. It made over $100 million worldwide. Critics who had ignored Seagal's earlier films actually praised this one. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars. Variety called it one of the best action films of the year. Director Andrew Davis had managed to do something impressive. He had reined in Seagal's bigger impulses, surrounded him with genuinely talented actors like Tommy Lee Jones and Gary Busey, and built a tight, coherent story around him. For one brief moment, it genuinely seemed like Seagal might evolve into something more than just a one-note tough guy.
Warner Brothers signed him to a multi-picture deal worth over $50 million. Toy companies made action figures of him. Video game developers competed to put his face in their games. Magazine covers described him as the next superstar. Entertainment Weekly ran a story asking if he would surpass Schwarzenegger. Steven Seagal stood at the absolute top of Hollywood. He had climbed from a strip mall dojo in Los Angeles to the very peak of the most powerful entertainment industry on Earth. The American dream turned up to maximum volume. And then, the masks started slipping. Here's what nobody told you about what it was actually like to work with Steven Seagal. On the set of every single film, the atmosphere wasn't creative or exciting. It was tense, exhausting, and unpredictable. Not because of dangerous stunts or complicated action sequences, but because Seagal's ego had grown into something that nobody could manage or control. Production assistants learned to avoid making eye contact with him. Crew members developed quiet warning systems to alert each other when he was approaching. Directors who were supposed to be in charge of the film discovered very quickly that their only real options were letting Seagal do whatever he wanted or preparing for a battle that would destroy the schedule, burn the budget, and potentially end their careers. Seagal would show up to set hours late. Sometimes he wouldn't arrive until after lunch had already come and gone. He'd blame everyone around him for the delay, demand that the crew work overtime to catch up, then disappear back to his trailer. When he finally emerged, he behaved as though the entire problem had been someone else's fault from the beginning. He'd rewrite scenes on the spot without warning, changing dialogue and action that the crew had spent days preparing. If another actor had a moment that was too clever, too funny, or too memorable, Seagal would find a way to shrink that moment or eliminate it entirely. The story was never allowed to be bigger than his character. His character was never allowed to look anything less than completely perfect. The stunt situation became famous for all the wrong reasons. Seagal loved telling interviewers about his commitment to performing his own stunts. He'd describe injuries he'd suffered for his craft, broken bones he'd endured, real hits he'd taken in the name of authenticity. He positioned himself as different from other action stars who relied on Hollywood's smoke and mirrors. Meanwhile, behind the camera, stunt coordinators were quietly doing the work. Seagal used doubles constantly. Wide shots where you couldn't see his face clearly, that's a double. Complex sequences involving multiple opponents, doubles handling most of it. Sometimes even the basic Aikido techniques, the moves Seagal supposedly mastered during a decade in Japan, were being performed by professional stunt performers, who then matched his movements in close-up shots. Using stunt doubles wasn't the problem. Every action star in Hollywood used them. That was just how the industry operated safely. The problem was that Seagal stood in interviews and claimed credit for work those professionals had done with their own bodies. Stunt performers who had broken bones, taken hard falls, and spent weeks choreographing complex sequences watched Seagal describe their injuries as his own. It violated an unspoken code of respect that the action film world took seriously. Then came the stories that couldn't be ignored. Actress Jenny McCarthy went on multiple talk shows and described an audition with Seagal that left her disturbed. He had repeatedly emphasized that she would need to remove her clothes for the role. She felt pressured, uncomfortable, and ultimately walked out. She described the entire setup as predatory and designed to make young actresses feel like they had no real choice. Other women came forward with similar accounts. Private auditions in hotel rooms, demands for nudity that weren't in any script, inappropriate touching disguised as fight choreography demonstrations. Hollywood heard these stories, studios heard these stories, agents heard these stories, and they kept quiet because Seagal was printing money. The cracks that had been forming quietly suddenly split open in front of everyone. Actor John Leguizamo was filming Executive Decision with Seagal in 1996. During a rehearsal, Leguizamo laughed at something. It was an innocent moment, the kind of thing that happens on every movie set. Seagal interpreted it as disrespect. He confronted Leguizamo, got in his face, used that famous cold stare that made audiences nervous in dark theaters. When Leguizamo didn't back down, Seagal allegedly slammed him into the wall. Cast and crew rushed to separate them. Leguizamo later told the story publicly on television, laughing about it and calling Seagal insecure and ridiculous. His willingness to laugh at the situation out loud was significant. It signaled that Seagal's ability to intimidate people into silence was weakening. Then came the story from Gene LaBelle. LaBelle was a genuine legend, a real martial artist with credentials in judo, wrestling, and stunt work that nobody could question. He'd worked on several of Seagal's films. According to LaBelle, and according to multiple people who claimed to have witnessed it, Seagal had been talking on set about how nobody could choke him out. It was the kind of boasting Seagal was known for. LaBelle, not seriously, just in the spirit of the moment, challenged him to prove it. LaBelle put him in a rear naked choke, and according to LaBelle and witnesses, Seagal lost consciousness and lost control of his body. Seagal denied the entire story furiously. He threatened lawsuits. He called LaBelle a liar. But the story had already spread through Hollywood like wildfire, passed from stunt coordinator to stunt coordinator, from director to director. Whether every detail was accurate or not almost stopped mattering. The myth of Steven Seagal as an unstoppable, unbeatable warrior had developed its first major crack. And once that myth cracked, people started looking at everything differently. In 1994, his personal assistant quietly left his employment and began talking about what she'd experienced working for him. 2 years later, a former model named Cassandra Harris filed a lawsuit alleging that Seagal had sexually harassed her during what was described as a casting session. The lawsuit described a pattern of behavior, not a single isolated incident. Hollywood studios now faced a clear choice: stand behind their profitable star or create distance before the damage became impossible to contain. They chose a middle path that was really just a slower version of abandonment. Seagal's budgets were quietly reduced. His creative control began disappearing. Warner Brothers let his contract expire without renewal. In 1994, Seagal directed a film called On Deadly Ground. He used it to deliver long, serious speeches about environmental destruction. He gave himself a mystical, spiritual dimension that the script couldn't support. He handed himself a heroic ending that went on for almost 10 minutes. Critics didn't just dislike it, they mocked it. Audiences who had loved him in Under Siege walked out of theaters confused and disappointed. Fire Down Below in 1997 earned $16 million against a $20 million budget. By 1998, The Patriot was going straight to video in most markets. The man who had commanded $10 million per film just 5 years earlier was now watching his theatrical career evaporate. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. Something else was happening that nobody wanted to discuss openly. The physical reality had changed. The lean, fast, dangerous-looking martial artist from above the law was not the man showing up on set anymore. The movements that had looked effortless in 1988 were slower now. The clothing got looser and darker. Camera angles became more carefully selected. Stunt doubles handled sequences that became more basic with each production. Seagal's health was clearly different, though he never addressed it directly or explained what had happened. Instead, the films tried to work around it. Seagal's characters would sit at tables while other people explained the plot. They would stand still, delivering dialogue. Every so often, he would perform 1 or 2 Aikido techniques, usually against opponents who seemed to fall before he actually touched them, and then collect his payment and leave. From 2000 to 2020, Seagal made more than 30 direct-to-video films that almost nobody watched. He would often appear in a handful of scenes, clearly filmed over just a few days, then edited into movies where other people carried the actual story. His scenes were shot completely separately from the rest of the cast, because according to everyone involved in those productions, nobody wanted to work closely with him. In 2005, Seagal made a decision that surprised everyone.
If America wasn't going to worship him, he would find somewhere that would. He began spending extended time in Russia. He started making public statements praising Vladimir Putin, calling him a strong and effective leader. He attended events as Putin's personal guest. The photographs from those events looked genuinely surreal. A former Hollywood action star sitting next to one of the most powerful political figures on Earth, both of them smiling warmly at each other. In 2016, Putin granted Seagal Russian citizenship in a formal ceremony. Seagal stood on a stage, hand over heart, pledging allegiance to a country that most Americans viewed with deep suspicion. Russian state television loved it. They had found exactly what they needed: an American celebrity, recognizable worldwide, willing to appear on their broadcasts praising Russia's government and criticizing American foreign policy. Seagal called himself a truth teller who had been rejected by Hollywood for refusing to play their games. Russian media broadcast that framing enthusiastically and repeatedly. Meanwhile, there was a tank. In 2009, Seagal had been appointed as a reserve deputy in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. It was designed as a publicity move, a way to remind America that he was the real deal, not just a movie star pretending to be tough. Instead, it produced one of the most embarrassing moments of his career. In 2011, Seagal participated in a raid on a property suspected of illegal cockfighting. His film crew came along to capture footage for a reality show called Steven Seagal, Lawman. During the raid, authorities drove an actual military tank into the property, killing dozens of animals, including a puppy. The property owner sued. The lawsuit described Seagal's behavior as reckless showboating, a law enforcement operation being treated like a Hollywood production so that one man could look impressive on camera. The reality show was supposed to rebuild his image. It destroyed what was left of it. Episodes showed Seagal positioning himself for dramatic camera angles after other officers had already secured situations. Real law enforcement professionals watched in secondhand embarrassment as their work was turned into a staged performance. Late-night comedians had material that practically wrote itself. The internet turned him into a recurring joke. Today, Steven Seagal is 72 years old and lives primarily in Moscow. He has been banned from entering Ukraine. The FBI has investigated his business connections to Russian officials. His name appears most often in entertainment journalism as an example of how completely and thoroughly a career can collapse. So what actually happened? How does the biggest action star in Hollywood become an industry outcast within a single decade? The easy answer is ego. He believed every word of his own mythology, treated the people around him terribly, and eventually faced consequences for it. But that explanation is too simple because Hollywood has never actually punished stars just for having enormous egos and difficult personalities. Think about it carefully. Tom Cruise has been legendarily demanding on set for decades and still makes blockbuster films. Christian Bale had an on-set meltdown that was recorded and played on radio stations around the world. His career barely paused. Mel Gibson said things publicly that should have permanently ended his standing in the industry. He directed an Oscar-nominated film years later. Hollywood forgives enormous amounts of bad behavior. The deciding factor has never really been morality. It has always been money. The deeper and more uncomfortable truth is that Hollywood created this problem, fed it, protected it, and then acted surprised when it got out of control. Michael Ovitz forced studios into giving an unknown Aikido instructor creative control that established stars hadn't earned. Warner Brothers built a marketing campaign around a manufactured mystery man with an invented past. Entertainment journalists reprinted Seagal's claims about his CIA work and underground fights without checking a single detail. The entire industry looked the other way when actresses described uncomfortable and predatory behavior because the films were profitable. When the box office numbers started dropping and the lawsuits started accumulating, those same studios and agents and journalists suddenly discovered that they cared very deeply about workplace conduct and personal integrity. They hadn't cared when it was costing them nothing. They cared when it started costing them money. The system didn't reject Steven Seagal because he was abusive. It rejected him because he stopped being profitable. But Seagal also destroyed himself, and that part is equally important to understand. He had real choices at every turning point, and he made the worst possible decision every single time. When the Jean LaBelle story spread through Hollywood, he could have laughed it off, told a self-depreciating version of the story himself, and shown enough human vulnerability to make people like him. Instead, he denied everything, attacked LaBelle publicly, and threatened legal action. That response confirmed every rumor about his insecurity. When the harassment allegations began accumulating, he could have handled them quietly, issued an acknowledgement, and moved carefully forward like countless other powerful figures in entertainment had done. Instead, he called every single accuser a liar, fought every single case, and burned every remaining relationship he had in the process. When his theatrical career declined, he could have accepted supporting roles, played memorable villains, shown that he had something interesting to offer beyond the same invincible character he'd been playing for a decade. Instead, he demanded top billing, refused any role that didn't position him as the most powerful person in the room, and kept insisting on a version of himself that audiences had already stopped believing in. He could have been a respected elder of action cinema, teaching the next generation, making sharp cameos in bigger films, being celebrated at conventions by fans who genuinely loved what he had done in his prime. Chuck Norris did exactly that. When Walker, Texas Ranger ended, Norris became a beloved cultural figure because he never once took himself too seriously. Jean-Claude Van Damme survived his own career collapse by admitting to mistakes, laughing at his own image, and rebuilding slowly on the foundation of genuine audience affection. Seagal had that option. He chose a different path every single time. Here is the saddest part of all of this. Underneath the lies, underneath the mythology, underneath the decades of ego and mismanagement and burning bridges, there was a genuinely skilled martial artist,
a young man from Michigan who had the courage and discipline to move to Japan at 17 years old, spend a decade mastering a difficult art form, build a school, earn real respect from real practitioners, and then walk into Hollywood and create something nobody had ever seen on a movie screen before. That person was real. That talent was real. But it got buried, layer by layer, lie by lie, year by year. It got buried under a version of Steven Seagal that Steven Seagal had invented and then become trapped inside of. The martial artist who could have a long, respected career chose the mythical warrior who couldn't show weakness. And the mythical warrior, eventually, had nowhere left to go. That is not a story about Hollywood's cruelty. That is a story about what happens when a person believes so completely in a version of themselves that isn't true that they lose the real version entirely. Steven Seagal had everything: real skill, real opportunity, real backing from the most powerful people in the industry. He had a genuinely unique gift and a genuinely remarkable early life story that was interesting and impressive on its own terms, without any additions or inventions. He threw it all away, protecting a lie. And that, more than anything else, is the cautionary tale that makes his story worth telling.